The question we're trying to answer today is, does Christmas honor Jesus? That's the title of the sermon. You know, this time of year, people are thinking about a lot of different things, and there's no holiday that's more universally observed or celebrated or recognized than the Christmas holiday, than the Christmas day. And many Christians, and even people who are not Christians, observe this holiday. And you may have different reasons for why they do it. And actually, it's interesting to know that thousands of years before Jesus came to this earth, there were people who actually went out into the forest and they cut down an evergreen tree and they'd bring it in, they'd trim the branches, they'd put it in their homes, they'd decorate it up with gold and silver and ornaments, and they would actually exchange gifts when they brought this tree into their home. And this is before Jesus came to earth. And they would give letters and cards, they would play games, they would sing songs, they were usually happy songs. And this was something that people did with this happy sort of seasonal spirit. 2,000 to 3,000 years before Jesus came to this earth. So we're looking at 4,000 and 5,000 years ago. Where did that come from? How did we get to where we are now? How did December 25th come to be the day that was so important to so many people, whether Christian or non-Christian? No matter what their belief, it seems. Well, let's take a look here. I have a reference from the Encyclopedia Britannica, Volume 2, 1973. I just want you to look at this to see that this is not, what I'm saying here is not something that's unusual or not well known. It says, in the Roman world, the Saturnalia was a time of merrymaking and exchanging gifts. Now, let me stop. Saturnalia was a time that they were observing. It was actually observed on December 25th. And we'll learn more about this as we go on. And it continues, it says, December 25th was also regarded as the birth date of the Iranian mystery god, Mithra, the son of righteousness. On the Roman New Year, houses were decorated with greenery and lights, and gifts were given to children. To these observances were added the German and Celtic Yule rites, food and fellowship, the Yule log and Yule cakes, greenery and fir trees, gifts and greetings, all commemorated different aspects of this festive season. Fires and lights, symbols of warmth and lasting life, have always been associated with the winter festival, both pagan and Christian. And that comes from the Encyclopedia Britannica, Volume 2, 1973. And I just copied and pasted that right from there. Actually, I had to type that one. That one I couldn't copy and paste. But I did type that out word for word, the way it was written there. So the question I think we need to answer today is, if we consider ourselves to be Christian, then maybe we should have some questions for ourselves. If we're Christian and we look at something like this and we see what it's rooted in, why do we find ourselves doing these customs? Is it because everybody else does it? Is it because we grew up that way? I think most of us here probably did grow up that way. I think the majority of people that I know that are Christian or non-Christian, they grew up in the traditions of, hey, it's a wonderful festive time of year. People's attitudes are different. They really are. It seems like people are happier till they get their credit card bill next month. Then they're not so happy. In fact, it's one of the things that I've learned being in business. A lot of people will have a necessity. They'll need to get something fixed on their car. And typically from about the middle of November through December, the statement is, well, I can't afford that right now. It's Christmas time. And, you know, if it's something that's a safety issue, is it that you can't afford it or that you won't afford it? Because if it's a safety issue, you can't afford not to fix it. Isn't that true? So where are our priorities? Why do Christians observe a festival that predates Jesus coming to this earth, that predates what people largely recognize as his birthday? And why are they part of modern Christianity today if these things predated Christ coming to the earth? Where did they really come from? This is what we want to establish. We see part of it in the opening statement there from the Encyclopedia Britannica. But I want you to notice that it's not just the encyclopedia. There was a book called Reader's Digest, Strange Stories and Amazing Facts. And I want you to see what this says. This covers several slides here. It says this, pages 283 to 285. Christmas and Easter, though the greatest festivals in the Christian calendar, are celebrated with customs that originated in superstition and heathen rites hundreds of years before Christ was born. Even the dates owe more to pagan practices than to the birth and resurrection of Jesus. It was not until the 4th century, I find that interesting, that December 25th was fixed arbitrarily as the anniversary of the Nativity, because the pagan festivals from which so many Christian customs spring were held around that time. It continues. Although Christianity has swept the world in a relatively short time, the missionaries faced an uphill task. The pagans were reluctant to give up their false gods and ancient practices. So the missionaries, unable to convert them easily to an entirely new code of worship, did the next best thing. I want to stop here for a minute. I find it interesting. The missionaries faced an uphill task. You know, when we profess the truth of God's Word, it's an uphill task. Everything that we profess, whether it's the Sabbath, when we talk to people out here that go to Sunday churches about the Sabbath, it's an uphill task to show them. Even though it's all biblical, they don't want to hear it. They're comfortable. They're set in their ways. My grandfather went to this church. My great-grandfather went to this church. My grandmother, and they go on and on. I've always come together on Sunday. So as God's people, when we preach these truths, the state of the dead, it's an uphill task to show people that. When we talk about the Father and His begotten Son, it's an uphill task for many people, for them to see these truths. And these missionaries had no different thing. Here they are, they're preaching the truth of God's Word, and it says they faced an uphill task, and the pagan people were reluctant to give up their false gods and ancient practices. You know, when I first came to the Sabbath truth, when it was first shared with me by my brother Claude, it was an uphill task for him to get me to admit that he was right. The funny thing is, I saw it right away, but I wouldn't admit it right away. It took me a while to get there. So it's any time that we have truth to offer, not the majority, but the minority of people are going to respond. That's just the way it is. It was no different hundreds of years ago, over 1,000 years ago when this was happening. So it says there, the missionaries, unable to convert them easily to an extremely new code of worship, this is talking about the pagans, did the next best thing. What's the next best thing? Well, take a look at this. They took the pagan festivals as they were and gradually grafted the observances of the new faith into these festivals and the rites and customs surrounding them. In other words, we adopt falsehood so that people will start coming to church and so that we can be popular among the people. It's sad, but that's what they did. This is one of the ways that this holiday came into the Christian church. And then it continues, December 25th was not called Christmas until the 9th century. Until then, it had been the midwinter feast, a combination of the Norse Yule festival and the Roman Saturnalia, both of which took place in late December. So I want you to think about this, friends. Here they were. They had these Christians had the truth. It's very much like what Constantine did when the Sabbath was being changed from Sabbath to Sunday, when it was being changed. Right? It's never changed. But what did Constantine do? He went with the masses. He went with the majority. And the majority usually are not right. And the truth is, very few of us, no matter what our background is, whether it's mine or yours or someone else's, we rarely take time to reflect on why we believe what we believe. Why do we accept the customs we accept? Why do I believe that Jesus is the Son of God that's begotten? Why do I believe that the dead are really dead? Why do I now believe that the Sabbath is a day that God made holy? You see? Until I was willing to examine those things in my mind and heart, I was never going to come to the truth. If I glossed it over and I was comfortable where I was, I wouldn't have a true relationship with the Father and His Son. It would just be on the surface. I'd be going through the rituals, through those things. We rarely examine the origins of the things and the customs that we've been a part of all of our life. And sometimes we might think, well, it really doesn't matter. It really doesn't make a difference. Does it make a difference? Everybody else is doing it, and I believe Brother Jim here, he's got a great relationship with God, and he's doing it. Well, we don't know what his relationship is with God. We can see what he's doing, but we don't know what's in here. You know, the Bible makes it painfully clear that the majority have always been outside of doing the will of God. Isn't that true? Jesus made that very clear. And in the case of Christmas observance, practically the whole world celebrates it. The fact is, we were born into a world filled with customs and traditions that we likely grew up accepting those things from the time we were children. Our parents did it. They taught it to us. That's how I grew up in the church I grew up in. And it took me years to study my way out of that. And I still have to study my way out of things that I've learned all of my life. I think we've all experienced that a bit. So, Christmas is one of these things that many of us have grown up with. Easter is no different. Halloween is no different. Any of the secular holidays that bring paganism or demonism into our understanding or our beliefs, they're usually things we grew up with. Because if we're a truth seeker, if we really want truth, once we examine it, we're probably going to start to divorce ourselves from those customs. And it might take some time. It doesn't come overnight. It really doesn't. But God has always rejected religious customs of paganism. Always. He's never accepted them. And many of the customs that are associated with Christmas today come from the Saturnalia, as we read. And there's a lot of evidence to show that even in the 3rd century A.D., which, remember, the 4th century was when these things really started to shift. But in the 3rd century, there was worship of Sol Invictus, which was a sun god. And this actually was worship of Saturn, which has to do with Saturnalia, which has to do with December 25th. You see, the days for many, if you've noticed, what's today? December the 23rd. And 2 days ago we had the winter solstice, didn't we? And Corey mentioned this on Wednesday night at Bible study, that, you know, the days, we have the shortest day of the year, and then as the days start getting longer, people recognized that many years ago. And so what they did was they were worshiping the birth or the rebirth of the sun. And that's why December 25th, again, is one of those days. Not the Son of God, but the sun, the rising and setting sun. And this is what Saturnalia has to do with. This is what the Sol Invictus has to do with. It's a time in late December when the days have gotten shorter and shorter, and then when they recognize they're getting longer, now let's celebrate. And, you know, I love when the days start getting longer. I don't like these short days. I really don't. But it's all part of how things are. And it was during the time that they had these celebrations that the sun seemed to be reborn. And it's interesting that we have the Son of God who was born from his Father sometime in eternity past. He was brought forth from the bosom of the Father, we're told in Scriptures. He was brought forth. And then he comes to this earth and he was born again. And they're saying that the Son, S-U-N, was born somehow, and that it's reborn every year after winter solstice. So it's a counterfeit. And it's interesting that most Christians observe the birth of Christ at that particular time when the sun god, people who worship the sun god, were worshiping this rebirth or this being born. So the earliest known times of these things was Tammuz in Babylon. Have you heard of Tammuz? Before I go, I want to show you this slide. I mentioned Sol Invictus. Sol Invictus. I got this, you can find this if you type that in any Google search. It's just hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of pictures. And it was the official sun god of the later Roman Empire and the patron of soldiers. In 274 AD, the Roman Emperor Aurelian made it an official cult alongside the traditional Roman cults. So I want you to notice, you see the head there, and you see those, looks like the rays of the sun coming off of his head. And if you've ever looked at any picture that the Catholic Church portrays of Jesus or Mary or any saint, you'll notice that it has that sun disk over their heads. And it all comes from this type of belief structure. So it's really kind of interesting. So the earliest known result of this actually comes from Tammuz of Babylon. Now, I don't know if you know anything about Tammuz. I think most of us here do. Nimrod was a mighty hunter in the Bible. And he actually, I think I'm getting ahead of my slides here. Nimrod had a wife, and they had a son, or his wife had a son after he died. I'm going to come back to that. I apologize for getting a little out of sorts. I've got another reference here I definitely want to share with you. The Encyclopedia Americana, 1944, it says this: Christmas, according to many authorities, was not celebrated in the first centuries of the Christian church. In the 5th century, the Catholic Church ordered it to be celebrated forever on the day of the Roman feast of the birth of Sol Invictus. That was the picture we just looked at a moment ago. As no certain knowledge of the day of Christ's birth existed. Do we know the day of Christ's birth? Does the Bible give us a date? No, it doesn't. We can deduce from the Bible the approximate time of Christ's birth, but it doesn't give us a date or a day even of his birth. We don't have that. We have the date and the day of his death, and we have the day of his resurrection. Very important things. But we don't have the date of his birth recorded in Scripture. So December 25th, how do we arrive at that day? You know, the fact is, we look at the customs that the Christian religion has put into this celebration of Christmas. We talked about the tree and the lights and all of these things. And I don't know if you realize it, but the tree itself is representative of eternal life because it's an evergreen tree. It's an evergreen tree. And this celebration actually goes all the way back to Babylon when Semiramis gave birth to her son Tammuz. Now remember, we said Nimrod married a woman named Semiramis. Semiramis was actually his mother. And Nimrod had died at this particular time. And then here his mother later on becomes pregnant and gives birth to a son named Tammuz. Well, what does she do? She gives credit of that to the rays of the sun, which she would point to the sun and say, this is Nimrod. And she said that impregnated this woman as if it were a virgin birth. Now, is that a counterfeit? Because we have the Father in heaven and his Son who was with him, and what happens? There's a virgin miracle where Christ Jesus is in the womb of Mary, a virgin birth. And all of these things are counterfeited. And when they looked at this tree and they bring this tree in, Nimrod, who was the sworn enemy of the true God Jehovah, he actually built this tower. Have we heard about it? Let me show you this real quick. I think I should have continued that. I've got my slides a little out of order. I apologize. But it talks, this is the Catholic Encyclopedia. I'll just go back to that. 1911 edition. Christmas was not among the earliest of the church, earliest festivals of the church. The first observance of this feast is from Egypt. It's pagan customs and centering around the January calends. But what I wanted to show you here was about Nimrod. Nimrod in Genesis chapter 10. This is where it first speaks of Nimrod. Have you ever heard of this? Cush fathered Nimrod in Genesis chapter 10, verses 8 and 9, and he began to be a mighty one in the earth. He was a mighty hunter before Jehovah. This is from the modern King James. Therefore it is said, even as Nimrod, the mighty hunter before Jehovah. Now what does that mean? a mighty hunter before Jehovah. You might think, well, that means that he was right there in front of God doing God's will. It could be read that way. But I want you to look at this word before in the Septuagint. The Greek Septuagint says, it's G 1726. I'm not sure how to say that word, in Antion, I guess. And it says, the presence of, or in view of, or before, or in the presence of. So that could mean he's a mighty hunter in the presence of the Most High God, Jehovah. But it's related to, it's the neuter of this word, G 1727, which means opposite, antagonistic, against, or contrary to. So a literal reading of the verse, even though the King James and the New King James and many translations say a mighty hunter before Jehovah, or before the Lord, or before God, the literal translation would say a mighty hunter in opposition to, or opposed to, or against the Most High God. And that's what this literally means when we look at that. So here we have this Nimrod, who's this mighty hunter who is opposed to God, and he's the one who actually had relations with his mother. If he did that, he must be opposed to God, because we know that that's something that's an abomination in the Bible. He married his own mom. And then, of course, we have Jewish historian Josephus. Have you ever heard of him? He records many things and actually substantiates much of what's in the gospel accounts. And I wouldn't take it as something that was inspired, but I believe that Josephus recorded a lot of history that we can look to. And Josephus and other historians make the comment that it was Nimrod's goal, if you remember the time period that he lived in, it was his goal to build this Tower of Babel. Remember, that's where the languages were confused. And Josephus and other people and other historians believe that he built this tower to the heavens to get away from the flood, should God ever flood the earth again. Because remember, it had flooded before this, and the whole earth was covered. So Nimrod had this idea, according to Josephus and other historians, that he built this tower into the heavens just in case it flooded. It was to be taller because I believe it said that the water was 15 cubits above the highest point of the earth when the flood had finished. So we're looking at about 45 feet. So it would be, a New York skyscraper today would be way above 45 feet, depending on where it was built. You could, if you put that skyscraper on top of Mount Ararat, how tall would it be? So Nimrod's purpose, for one, was to build this in opposition to God. Some people believe that he built it to be able to get to the heavens to attack God. We don't know for sure. But whatever the case, God stopped the building of that. And I don't think I have that in my slides. Let's turn there to Genesis. I just want you to see that. I think this is very important. Genesis chapter 9, verse 11, it says, thus I established my covenant. I'm sorry, this is about the flood. This is the promise that God made. So this is how we know that God would never flood the earth again. And this is how we know that Nimrod was building this tower unnecessarily, if that's one of the reasons he built it. Thus I established my covenant with you. Never again shall all flesh be cut off by the waters of a flood. Never again shall there be a flood to destroy the earth. So he's not saying there won't be local floods, but he's saying, I'm not going to destroy the whole earth. And God said, this is the sign of the covenant which I make between me and you and every living creature that is with you for perpetual generations. And then here it is in verse 13, I set my rainbow in the cloud, and it shall be a sign of the covenant between me and the earth. So if Nimrod had believed this covenant, if he had understood what the rainbow stood for, he wouldn't have to build that tower for that purpose. And if he would have done what God had wanted him to do in the first place, he wouldn't have started building this tower, because what did God want? He wanted to disperse the people. He wanted people to spread abroad, spread over the earth, but Nimrod said, no, I'm going to keep them right here. This is my kingdom. So he was obviously, all of this evidence is to show that Nimrod wasn't just in the presence of or before God. He was in opposition to God. He was in opposition to everything he stood for. These are the things that are so important when we look into the history of where these customs come from. Who are the ones who originated them? What was the purpose of their origins? So we talked a little bit about Tammuz. We've talked about Nimrod. And were you aware that the actual tree, the evergreen tree, is representative of Nimrod? Because whether you realize it or not, I have a book here that gives you a lot of information. I don't recommend, this is more of a history and a reference book than, it's not just writing. It's tons and tons, hundreds and hundreds of references in here. This is The Two Babylons. And it's written, put together by a minister in the late 1800s who was a Baptist minister. And he recognized that the two Babylons, or papal worship, he says. And he talks in here about the Trinity doctrine and where it came from, how it worked its way into Christianity. He talks about the pagan holidays and how they came into existence into the Christian church. He talks about the worship of Nimrod and his wife in here. And it's if you want to look at it, it's very difficult to read, but some of the references that I've taken have come directly from here, and they're verified by a lot of historians. But I thought you might be interested in that. But the thing is, Nimrod actually took his wife rather, Semiramis, when she wanted to keep control of these people, she goes out and has an evergreen tree cut down, and she puts it into the palace, and she decorates it. And she says, for a period of time, she says, this is Nimrod, let's bow and worship him. He's been reincarnated in some fashion. And so they brought it in, and this is where some of the customs of bringing a tree into a home started. And we don't recognize what we're doing. Just to show you, I've got a sign here. I think I've showed this to you before in years past. There was a camper back in the late 60s, early 70s, maybe even back into the 50s, I'm not sure, called Nimrod. And you notice the logo is an evergreen tree. And I find it very intriguing that it's America's most popular camper at that time. And it was very, very popular. And I find it interesting, too, that you see 3 trees there. 3 trees, which indicates some kind of triunity, you see. And it's just, when we look at all of these things, and then we look at the shape of the tree and how they try to accentuate the triangle in there. And all of this goes back to Satan worship. It's just unbelievable. The more you dig, the worse it gets. The worse it gets. It continues on and on and on. So what we want to consider, though, is that many times people are doing these things and they have no idea. They don't even think about it. And, parents and even preachers will get up in front of a church. I know of, in this local area, probably a dozen preachers that I personally know that are going to be preaching tomorrow about Monday, the following day, which will be December 25th, being the birthday of Jesus Christ. But they know better. So really, what are they doing? If we're preaching that this is the day that Christ was born, and we know that he wasn't, how could you get up in front of a group of people and say that if you knowingly realize that? I don't know how they do it. Again, the Bible doesn't give us a date. Wouldn't it be nice if they put the emphasis on that? The Bible doesn't give us a date. Perhaps we should get away from some of these customs. I wonder if a preacher will preach that tomorrow or today. How many preachers are going to preach that type of thing? God has warned us not to add to or take away from the things he commanded. I find no mandate in the Bible that tells us to celebrate the birth of Christ, but I do find a mandate to tell us to celebrate his death, which buys us eternal life. And Jesus said that worship would be in vain because you worship the traditions of men. You hold those traditions and you neglect the commandments of God. That's what he said in Matthew chapter 7, in the Sermon on the Mount. That's where he said that. And God has given us many, many examples throughout the Bible. In fact, in the Apostle Paul in 1 Corinthians chapter 10 actually shows us that the mistakes that Israel made, we're going to go back to the time of Israel just for a few minutes, the mistakes that they made, and they were recorded for us today so that we could come to a knowledge. In fact, I think I have this. 1 Corinthians chapter 10. Yes, I do. Beginning in verse 1. Here's what Paul says. Moreover, brethren, I do not want you to be unaware that our fathers were under the cloud. All passed through the sea. This is talking about Israel when they were coming from Egypt. All were baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea, and all ate the same spiritual food, and all drank the same spiritual drink, for they drank of the spiritual rock that followed them, and that rock was Christ. But with most of them God was not well pleased, for their bodies were scattered in the wilderness. So we see there, God wasn't pleased with the majority of them, but he saved them through the Red Sea. He brought them through. Even though he wasn't pleased with them, he brought them through. And the account continues in verse 6. It says, now these things became our examples. Paul's talking to the people in his day, and he can be talking to us today through these verses. These things became our examples to the intent that we should not lust after evil things as they also lusted. And do not become idolaters, as were some of them. As it is written, the people sat down to eat and drink and rose up to play. And this is referring to Exodus chapter 32. In fact, I don't have this in the PowerPoint. Let's turn there. Exodus 32, second book of the Bible. We're going to read several verses from here. This is extremely important. Extremely important. Exodus chapter 32. And I want to begin in verse 1. It says, now when the people saw that Moses delayed coming down from the mountain. So what had happened? He was up on Mount Sinai, wasn't he? And they saw that he was delaying. The people gathered together to Aaron, who was Moses' brother. He was also the high priest, and said to him, come, make us gods that shall go before us. For as for this Moses, the man who brought us up out of the land of Egypt, we do not know what has become of him. So he's been up there for quite a while. They're wondering what's going on. Where is he? So they want Aaron to make them gods to worship. And Aaron said to them, break off the gold earrings which are in your ears of your wives, your sons, and your daughters, and bring them to me. So all the people broke off the golden earrings which were in their ears and brought them to Aaron. Let me ask you, where had they come from? They had come out of Egypt. That's why they had all this gold, because they had learned the customs of the Egyptians, and they were wearing this gold jewelry that the Egyptians had taught them about over a period of about 430 years. So they had adopted the customs of the pagans. These were God's people. So God brings them through the Red Sea. He's trying to re-instruct them. He wants to get them back to where they need to be. And this is what happens. They take their gold out. They give them to Aaron. And verse 4, it says, and he received the gold from their hand, and he fashioned it with an engraving tool and made a molded calf. And they said, this is your God, O Israel, that brought you up out of the land of Egypt. Notice they didn't say this is another God. They didn't say this is one of Egypt's mighty gods. But they looked at this God and they said, this is the God that brought us through and out of Egypt. Who is the God that brought them out of Egypt? It was Jehovah God. It was the Most High God. So it's clear by the context that this calf was made to represent the only true God. Isn't that what we see here? That's what I see. And these people were trying to honor the one true God. Isn't that true? They were trying. That was their intent. They wanted to worship the one true God. They even gave their valuable gold, their jewelry, all of the things of monetary value. The gold is worth a lot of money even then. And what do? They bring it. And they gave their valuable gold in his honor, in the honor of the one true God. I hope you're paying attention to this, because this is very important. And it appears that the people's hearts, they seemed right toward God. Isn't that the way it looks? It appears that way. After all, even Aaron, this high priest, he had built this altar and this calf himself. He fashioned it it says. And he put an altar there in verses 5 and 6. It says, so when Aaron saw it, he built an altar before it. And Aaron made a proclamation and said, tomorrow is a feast to Jehovah. He's talking about the one true God here. It's a feast to Jehovah. Then they rose early on the next day, offered burnt offerings and brought peace offerings, and the people sat down to eat and drink and rose up to play. This is what we just read right there in 1 Corinthians. But you notice that God was dissatisfied with this. Aaron was not proclaiming a feast to a false god, but he was proclaiming it to the Most High God, Jehovah. Yet, it displeased God. Why? Aaron knew better. Aaron should have known better. Let's put it that way. He was the priest. These people gave all of their things. They made sacrifices on the altar. And how did God respond? What was his response? Let's take a look. Verse 7. And Jehovah said to Moses, go, get down. He's sending him down off the mountain. For your people whom you brought out of the land of Egypt have corrupted themselves. You notice God says, your people. It's like a parent, when I did something wrong, mom would say, that's your son. But when I did something right, I was mom's son. You see? And God's no different. Your people, Moses, your people, they've corrupted themselves. They have turned aside quickly out of the way which I commanded them. Remember, they had said they would do everything God said to do previously. We'll do everything just the way you've said. How quickly we forget. How quickly we forget. We're just as guilty as they are, friends. We would do the same thing very likely. So we have to stay focused. The verse continues, they have made themselves a molded calf and worshipped it and sacrificed to it and said, this is your God, O Israel, that brought you out of the land of Egypt. And Jehovah said to Moses, I have seen this people indeed. It is a stiff-necked people. Now therefore let me alone that my wrath may burn hot against them and I may consume them and I will make you a great nation. He's telling Moses, I'm going to kill all of them and I'm going to make you a great nation. So did this anger God? Absolutely. Absolutely. Because even though they were doing it for the right reason, they knew better. They had been instructed, they had been commanded, and they said they would do it. Verse 11, then Moses, what a man he is, then Moses pleaded with the Lord his God, with Jehovah God, and said, Jehovah, why does your wrath burn hot against your people, whom you have brought out of the land of Egypt with great power and with a mighty hand? Verse 12, why should the Egyptians speak and say, he brought them out to harm them, to kill them in the mountains, to consume them in the face of the earth? Turn from your fierce wrath, and relent from this harm to your people. Remember Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, your servants, to whom you swore by your own self. And you said to them, I will multiply your descendants as the stars of heaven, and all this land I have spoken of I give your descendants, and they shall inherit it forever. So Jehovah relented, I think the King James says, repented from the harm which he had said he would do to his people. And Moses turned and went down from the mountain, and the 2 tablets of the testimony which the commandments were on, that were in his hand, tables were written on both sides. On one side and on the other they were written. Now the tablets were the work of God, and the writing was the writing of God engraved on the tablets. And when Joshua heard the noise of the people as they shouted, he said to Moses, there is a noise of war in the camp. But he said, it is not the noise of the shout of victory, nor the noise of a cry of defeat, but the sound of singing I hear. So it was as soon as he came near the camp and saw the calf and the dancing, so Moses' anger became hot. Now Moses is mad. And he cast the tablets out of his hands and broke them at the foot of the mountain. Then he took the calf which they had made, burned it in the fire, and ground it to powder, and he scattered it on the water and made the children of Israel drink it. And Moses said to Aaron, What did this people do to you that you have brought so great a sin upon them? Moses knew Aaron knew better. That's what I get from that verse. What did they do to you that made you do this? And I want to back up to verse 20 just for a minute. I know I'm going a little long here, but this is so important. Verse 20. Did Moses take the calf and say, you know, I'm sure the Egyptians, this is a lot of gold, I'm sure they would appreciate it if I gave it to them because they worship the calf anyway. Is that what did he do with it? He ground it to powder. If I have something that I know is a pagan image, that's a vestige of something that comes from paganism, once I learn that, do I pass it on to someone else so that they can do the same? Or do I grind it to powder? If I know something is against God's will, do I continue in it? Do I give it to someone else so that they can do it? If I learn that smoking cigarettes is wrong, do I say, you know, I got this pack of cigarettes, I'm going to quit. Here, you can have them. I shouldn't do that. I should destroy them. All of the CDs and DVDs and the records and tapes that I had of all of this music that was so questionable and movies that were questionable, that I say, you know what, I know somebody else that would enjoy listening to this satanic garbage. No, I destroyed them. You get the picture? And when the people in the book of Acts saw that the books that they had were full of witchcraft, what did they do? They brought them together and they burned them. They destroyed them. This is an example that Moses gave for those things. You ground it to powder. And then let's pick up again in verse 22. It says, Aaron said, do not let the anger of my Lord become hot. He's speaking to Moses. You know the people, that they are set on evil. For they said to me, make us gods, and that shall go before us. As for this Moses, the man who brought you out of the land of Egypt, we do not know what became of him. And I said to them, whoever has any gold, let them break it off. So they gave it to me, and I cast it into the fire, and this calf came out. Man, even here, Aaron's saying, I threw the gold in, and the calf came out. No, it tells us over here in verse 4, he fashioned it with an engraving tool. He worked on it. He made it. He built it. And he built an altar for it. But he's saying this calf came out. I mean, we have to be honest with ourselves, friends. Now, when Moses in verse 25 saw that the people were unrestrained, for Aaron had not restrained them to their shame among their enemies, then Moses stood in the entrance of the camp and said, whoever is on Jehovah's side, come to me. And all the sons of Levi gathered themselves together to him. And he said to them, thus says Jehovah, the God of Israel, let every man put his sword on his side and go in and out from entrance to entrance throughout the camp, and let every man kill his brother, every man his companion, and every man his neighbor. So the sons of Levi did accordingly to the word of Moses. It says, and about 3,000 men of the people fell that day. Doesn't mean they fell down. They were killed. They were destroyed. These men were destroyed for the things that they were doing. And I find this really interesting because as we go through this account, that's Exodus 32:28. Isn't that what I just read? Then Moses said, consecrate yourselves today to Jehovah, that you may bestow on you a blessing for this day. For every man has opposed his son and his brother. And I find it interesting as you read through this account, Moses was saying to blot me out of your book. Let's just continue reading. It's just a few more verses. Verse 30. Now it came to pass on the next day that Moses said to the people, you have committed a great sin, so now I will go up to Jehovah. Perhaps I can make atonement for your sin. Moses was a sort of mediator there, wasn't he? It says, then Moses returned to Jehovah and said, oh, these people have committed a great sin and have made for themselves a god of gold. Yet now if you will forgive their sin, but if not, I pray, blot me out of your book which you have written. And Jehovah said to Moses, whoever has sinned against me, I will blot him out of my book. So Moses was faithful. He was faithful in this regard. And when we read through this account, you see, these people had turned aside from what God had commanded them. God has a specific way that he wanted to be worshipped and that he wants to be worshipped today. And Israel had acted like they were a people without any authority from the Most High God. This is how they were acting when they did this. They had no authority to make an image of God. They had no authority to proclaim a festival to God that God didn't ask for. And God was angry because they were doing not what was right in his eyes, but what was right in their own eyes. Well, yeah, I know I put this tree in here, and I know I celebrate, and I decorate, and I do all the... But I'm not doing it for that reason. God was ready to kill all of them. Every single one of them. He was angry because they weren't following the things that he asked them and that they agreed to do. That's the thing. They said, we will do all you ask. We will do it. Following their own way. In fact, do I have that next text here? No, I don't. Let me fast forward through this. I kind of got ahead of myself. Proverbs 16, this is the text I wanted. Proverbs 16:25. There is a way that seems right to a man, but the end of it is the ways of death. So do we follow our own way? Or do we follow the ways that God wants us to follow? You see, God is ultimately saying that if it's our way, it's going to lead us to death. So Christmas observance today, once we're informed, a lot of people are doing it being uninformed, but I know many Christians that know the truth about this, yet they continue to do these festivals. They continue to do these things and celebrate these days and do all of these decorations knowing what they're rooted in. And when we do that, it's no different than the Israelites here in Exodus chapter 32 that we just considered. It's no different. And if it is, I'd like to know how it's different. What makes it different? You see, the Israelites observed it to honor God. Christians today believe they're doing these things to honor God. They believe that they're celebrating the birth of Christ. And I feel for those who are ignorant about this. It's our duty to hold them accountable and teach them these things, to help them to see what these truths are, especially the religious leaders. I hold the leaders accountable. When I know a pastor that knows these things and they continue to preach those things, I ask them point blank, how can you do that? And some of the answers I get, it's just, well, you know, one pastor told me, if I taught what I knew was truth, I wouldn't have a church, nobody would be there. Well, you know what? That's okay. If nobody comes, I'll bet you there'll be one or two that might. There's always going to be a minority that want to follow the Most High God. So keeping His commandments. You know, and it's possible that there are people who are watching this. Some of you here may not have been familiar with some of these things. It might catch you off guard when you hear these things. And it can be an adjustment. It's quite an adjustment. I know, Rick and Mary, you've told me that over the years it's been an adjustment for you guys. And, you know, we're here to help. I mean, I've had to make adjustments in my life that weren't easy with Sabbath and things like that, with clean and unclean meats. So, you know, when we think about those things, these things are really a small sacrifice to make for pleasing the Most High God. Isn't that true? And I believe I have a closing text here. 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, verses 8 through 12. This is at the end of time. It says, "And then the lawless one will be revealed, whom the Lord shall consume with the breath of his mouth and destroy with the brightness of his coming." Is he going to destroy those who are doing God's will, who are living up to the light that they have? No. You see, God was ready to consume Israel because they were knowingly doing what was wrong. Verse 9, "Whose coming is accordance to the working of Satan with all power and signs and lying wonders, and with all deceit of unrighteousness in those who perish, because they did not receive the love of the truth, so that they might be saved. And for this cause God shall send them strong delusion, that they should believe a lie." In other words, he's not going to force you to believe the truth. If you want to believe the lie, he'll allow you to do it, and this will result in strong delusion. So that all those who do not believe the truth, but delight in unrighteousness, might be condemned. And really, that's what it boiled down to for those Israelites. They were delighting in the things that God said not to do. It's fun. You know, when I walk out and I go out into the world, if I drove around my neighborhood tonight, I would see some of the most beautiful lights and trees and greenery. It's gorgeous. I love it. I love seeing it. It's beautiful. I hear some of the songs playing on the radio and I'm thinking, oh man, I love this song. And then when I hear it, I'm saying, whoa, wait a minute, that has false doctrine all through it. And some of the songs don't. Some of the songs that we would traditionally sing in churches at Christmas time have biblical doctrine. But why just sing them at Christmas time? If it's biblical, why can't we sing them year-round? Why just preserve it for that 1 or 2 weeks in the wintertime that we're getting close to a false holiday? You see? So hopefully this will open your eyes a little bit. I do want to show you one last slide. Rick sent me this text. Can you see that from your seat? Can everybody see that? I'm having a hard time reading it from here. Here's what it says. This is a billboard. I don't know where this was. Rick sent this to me. It says, "Dear Christians, our family would like to thank you for continuing all of our holiday traditions. Our Christmas tree, wreaths, Easter bunnies, and eggs still honor us, your pagan gods, Baal, Ishtar, and Tammuz." Wow. Somebody knows what's going on, don't they? I don't know if you can read that or not. But Rick, do you know where that came from? He sent that to me weeks ago, and I found an opportunity to use it. So, you know, these are interesting things, friends, and I hope that this will help you to make an informed decision about what we do with these holidays. How are we going to react? How will we respond? And, you know, my prayer is that you will consider these things, that you're not offended by them, but you see from the Scriptures and from the things that we've examined today what the Most High God requires of us.